I'm Mike Costello, and I'd like to talk to you in the next few minutes about isolation and loneliness and overcoming our individual isolation. Psychologists and sociologists tell us that loneliness and isolation are one of the primary negative feelings that we have as a people. And yet we're surrounded by people, most of us, in our daily lives. We have families or friends. We have people who live in our homes. We go to market and to school, to shops, and to different places where we're surrounded always by different numbers of people. And yet, even though we're surrounded by people, we many times feel lonely and isolated. I'd like to talk to you about some ways in which we can overcome isolation, the feeling of isolation and loneliness. So often we compensate for feeling lonely and isolated by eating more, by taking drugs or tranquilizers, by watching television, by shopping, different ways to ease our feeling of being isolated. But in reality, the truth is that isolation and loneliness have to do with something that's happening inside of us instead of things that are happening outside of us. If in reality isolation and loneliness were coming because we were truly isolated or alone, we would not be exposed to other people. We wouldn't have people around us. But when we feel isolated and alone, we often have these other people around us that don't necessarily fill the emptiness in our lives. We need to accept the reasons for our loneliness, and those reasons have to do with things that are going on inside of us. There is a dynamic of mind action, a law of mind action. We believe that we live in our minds and not in the world. And so as we think, and the process of our mind unfolds, circumstances and situations present themselves to us. We have a capacity to overcome and step beyond isolation and loneliness. But in order to do that, we have to feel comfortable with ourselves. We have to build upon our own individual integrity and value, and we have to create within our minds and within our lives the reality that there is more than us being isolated. We believe that there is a connection that is divine, that is true, and that is real, and it connects us to that which is divine or spiritual. If we connect ourselves with the infinite source of our life, we can and we need never be alone and never need be isolated. It isn't the people around us that will give us validation and make us feel that we are less lonely. It is our own thinking and our own connectiveness to the value of ourselves. We need to begin the process, if we're people who feel lonely and isolated often, we need to begin the process of saying no to isolation in our minds. And that is choosing not to allow this feeling to take over our consciousness and our awareness. We say often that we live in our minds and not in the world, and we believe that. You live in your mind, I live in my mind, and all of us live in our minds as much as we live in the outer world. And our challenge is to control and to participate in the process of the creative power of our mind to create a happy, joyful, and experience of life that is going to be fulfilling. If we say no to isolation, we begin to look within ourselves to identify what it is that makes us feel isolated. Some of us feel isolated because we feel less than adequate. We feel less than loved. We may feel isolated because of things that have happened to us in our childhood, things that people have told us. But what we need to do is to embrace the concept of our mind in dynamic action and allow our mind to create within us a sense of value, a capacity to be loved and to give love, and to encircle and enfold ourselves in the reality that we are never truly alone, and that people and circumstances and situations don't fulfill our need for filling the lonely spots of our lives. We need to use our mind dynamic wisely, and we need to be conscious of the way in which we're thinking. If you're a person who feels alone or isolated often, go within your mind and examine, go back and retrace the way that your mind behaves and acts. As you begin to feel isolated and alone, your mind builds upon that concept, much as depression builds upon the concept of depression. And the more you begin to feel isolated and alone, the more your mind reinforces that reality and that truth. By creating a visualization or an idea within your mind that you are never truly alone, that you are always surrounded by love and light, by the positive aspects of the universe, you begin the process of changing the way that your mind is operating and embracing a concept that detaches you from separation and from loneliness. We all need to use the dynamic of our mind wisely, and we need to understand that as our thought process begins in a certain direction, if it is moving us in a negative way, we have a choice to change the way that we think. We have a choice to create a law of attraction within the dynamic of our mind and to create the awareness of the fact that we are never really and truly alone as long as we're connected with that which is divine. One of the great premises of New Thought is to connect our mind with divine mind. That is to connect our human mind and thought process with the divine mind of God, of the infinite, and to know that that infinite resource, that divine love and light of God, is always accessible to us, and that if our human mind connects with that divine mind, then we are really and truly never alone. Not only are we never alone, but we can never be isolated. We may be isolated and move from people or relationships or family or circles of friends, but the constant connectiveness that we all have is to the divine power of God and to the universal potential of infinite intelligence and the unconditional love and direction of divine mind coming into our physical mind and guiding and directing us in new and wonderful ways. One of the useful things that techniques that can be used in this process is the technique of creative visualization. And that is when we see our mind moving us in a negative way, when we see our mind thinking that we're alone or isolated, when we see our mind creating a depression or a negative influence, that we begin the process of creatively visioning ourselves in another way, so in a positive way, in an affirming way, and connecting ourselves always with divine mind, with the divine spirit of God. And as we do that, we're never truly alone. And as we do that, we open ourselves to be receptive to the connectiveness of the love of other people. We can't reach out to others and invite them into our circle. We can't reach out to embrace others until we believe ourselves to be acceptable and dynamic and powerful and receptive to the connectiveness that we have with other people. And that connectiveness begins in our mind. It begins with that which connects us to the divine. We live in our minds and not in the world. We have the ability always and everywhere to overcome our feelings of isolation and loneliness by beginning through the thought of our connectiveness to God. And then as we are connected to that which is divine and we know that we're never really and truly alone, we can open ourselves to be receptive to other people, we can reach out to other people, and we can overcome the negative influence of isolation and loneliness. The process begins within us, not outside of us, and the process begins in our mind because mind has the creative function of creating the environment in which we live and the world in which we live. It's not as difficult as it sounds. It is a process that requires our conscious awareness, and it begins with our claiming who and what we are as children of God. We'd like to invite you at this point in the program to pause for a few moments of prayer and reflection. We believe that prayer is a centering force and that it has healing and restorative power. And so we'd like to invite you now to join with us in a prayer meditation. Eternal God, we gather together in the conscious awareness of your presence, and we ask that you would relieve us of the isolation and the loneliness that we sometimes feel in our human lives. And we connect ourselves with your divine and infinite intelligence. We connect ourselves with all other people around us, and we open ourselves in a loving and positive fashion in the name of faith, in the name of hope, in the name of love. Amen.
That was a wonderful talk about loneliness, and loneliness is such a prevalent thing in our society today, and we wonder how people can be lonely because there's so many things to do and so many other people to take care of, so many things we can do to help others. And I have the idea that the people who get most lonely are those who don't reach out to others at all. What do you think of that?
I think that's true, and I think that as we reach out to others, we also need to believe in our own ability to connect with other people. I think so often we're surrounded by other people, and yet we don't feel worthy, we don't feel strong enough, we don't feel empowered enough to really reach out and embrace people. And so we end up being surrounded by people. But in this process of being surrounded by people, we become more and more isolated because we pull back.
Yes, and then if we don't reach out to God, we then are very, very lonely indeed. And that, I think, is another facet of that problem. The people who are most lonely don't have an inner spiritual life. Do you think that might be true?
I think it's absolutely true. And I think we need to begin with the process of connecting ourselves consciously and subconsciously. And we can do that through prayer. We can do it through visualization. We can do it through meditation. By connecting ourselves with the presence of God. That's not to say that we haven't always been connected,
Yes.
but we need to keep ourselves mindful of the fact that we are always connected to God, to the divine, and to the spiritual side of life, and therefore we're never really alone. And then if we begin with that, the fact that God and we are one, and because God and we are one, we're never alone, we begin to be able to reach out to other people. And we also are able then to let go of relationships, which I think is something that we all need to learn, because our lives are filled with people who come in and go out. Even if someone comes into our life and they're there for 40 or 50 years, the time is going to come when that person's going to go out of our life. They're going to move away, a relationship's going to end, they're going to die, we're going to die, and that transition's going to take place. And so that ability to let people go and to know that as we let people go, others will come and take their place.
And we have to allow that and encourage it, or it won't happen, because other people might be just as lonely as the lonely one. And so it's like a round robin. And also there's that meditative state that is not loneliness, but it's just it's a form of self-isolation to be alone, and that's a wonderful space to be in. But if we go into total isolation just for spiritual purposes, then I think we're copping out in life. We can't do that, because there are those great ones in the past who have been hermits in Tibet and so forth, and they've lived a life of prayer, and that's been a totally different situation. The people who are born into an area of civilization needs to interact with that civilization, or they're not fulfilling their destiny on the planet.
Sure. Most of us are called into life. So often people will say religiously that we're in the world but not of it.
Yeah.
Well, most of us are called into the world, and we need to be of it because we believe that we're here to learn. And so if we don't participate in life, we're not in the learning process.
That's correct. And we can't just cop out, because if we do, it's just simply that. And then we're not really growing and growing spiritually, as would be the purpose of becoming isolated. So there are those who are afraid to reach out to others, and I don't know if you would have some clues on what makes people afraid to reach out to others, and how they can what they need to do in order to be more fulfilled in that way.
Well, I think people begin by being and looking at that difference between being alone and being lonely. I think we need to be able to be alone and to be comfortable to be alone with ourselves. And then as we're comfortable being alone with ourselves, then we're comfortable expanding ourselves out and reaching out to other people. I think those who cannot be alone and who are lonely when they are alone tend to be people who can't connect with others. And of course, the challenge for all of us is to connect with all of those around us, and to connect with people we like and the people we dislike, and to embrace that collective connectiveness that we have.
That's quite a dichotomy, isn't it, what you just said, that the people who are afraid who can't connect with others are the ones who are most lonely, but they have to have noise and confusion around them. I used to know a gentleman who always had to have the radio or TV on all the time. He came in the house, he would turn on the radio or the TV, and that would drive many people crazy, but he gained a great deal of consolation from just having that noise on.
He needed some activity around, and he was probably a person who wasn't comfortable in solitude. and wasn't comfortable, because in solitude we really have to confront ourselves.
Yes.
And we have to take a look at who we are. And many times we don't feel comfortable looking at ourselves. And if that's the case, then we need to do some work so that we're comfortable with ourselves, because we certainly can't be comfortable with others before we're comfortable with ourselves.
True. Well, that was an interesting aspect of his life, is that he couldn't connect with other people very well, but yet he wanted to. He wanted very much to do so.
Mm-hmm.
He tried reaching out, but sometimes he would feel rebuffed, and perhaps he wasn't even rebuffed, but he was so insecure that he would feel rebuffed.
And that's key too. I think this feeling of insecurity that comes from who knows where. I mean, different people's insecurities come from different sources, some from childhood, some from being hurt, some from feelings of inadequacy, some from their own creation. But I think if people find themselves in that situation, they need to confront that and look at it and be willing to learn and move on.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a difference in wanting to reach out to people right and left, and having people all around you, and then just not really simply having the time for others because of work and family obligations. Then there are those people who don't have time to reach out, and they're not the lonely ones. The ones who stay busy, the busy people are not the lonely people.
Mm-hmm, that's true. And then the other side of it is, I think we have to be in a conscious state of life in order to both share ourselves with others and enjoy other people. So often we go through life and we don't even see the people around us. We drive our cars and we don't know how we got where we're supposed to go because we're in a semi-conscious or unconscious state, and yet we're able to function. We walk down the street, or we go to school, we go to work, and we fail to see people. We fail to acknowledge people. And I think then we begin to see an isolation that is drawing us. These people are being drawn within themselves. They're immersed within themselves, and they're also very often in the past or in the future, not in the present moment. Or if they're in the present moment, they're so absorbed with themselves or their problems or their burdens that they fail to see other people. And that creates an unconscious state. And if we're conscious, we can't walk around and fail to acknowledge people.
Mm-hmm. So that just reaching out to others would be one way of breaking that. A woman I know who's most lonely of anyone I know and complains all the time of being lonely, doesn't reach out to others. She's not involved. She's past retirement age. She doesn't involve herself in any clubs or organizations that help the less fortunate. And she doesn't reach out to her family very well, and her family doesn't reach out to her very often. And so she's very lonely. But it's hard to explain to someone how to break this lonely pattern, because it seems they just get locked in. It solidifies around them.
It's very much like depression. And I don't know this lady, obviously, but I would imagine that her mind dynamic, or the way that she thinks and the things that she says, many times surround the negative aspects of life. And she is within herself in a negative way, much like a depressed person continues to get more and more depressed, to go within themselves, to become more and more angry, and to become more and more isolated. And I think that creates in and of itself a loneliness, and also a building of negative influence within the person.
You know, you hit a key there, because her children say the reason they don't come to visit her is because, I've discussed it with them in a pleasant way, is because she's so negative, that she says something negative about everything they do or say, and they don't tell her their plans when they have new plans, because they know she's going to be so negative about it that she'll break the charm of the new plan.
And the dynamic of her mind, just as we said in the talk a few minutes ago, her mind dynamic, which she's not being cautious of, is building and building upon negativity. And the negativity draws her deeper and deeper within herself. And as she goes deeper and becomes more negative, she becomes more isolated. And as she becomes more isolated, people don't want to be around her.
Exactly. So it's just a round robin. Well, if people would just meditate, just look to God through meditation and through prayer, I think that is somewhat the answer. Because then if they do that enough, they reach out to others. And if they ask for guidance, because whatsoever you shall ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive. If we want to receive a knowledge on how to be a good friend and how to attract others to us, then we will be guided.
Absolutely. We'll be guided and directed. And of course, prayer and meditation are centering forces. And if we find our mind operating in a negative way, or if we find any negative influence, we're lonely, we're isolated, we're depressed, we're hurt, we're guilty, any of those negative influences building within our consciousness, our awareness, we need to draw ourselves within, center ourselves in prayer and meditation, and change, bring into our consciousness something, and that something is the power of God
Yes.
or the angelic beings, to break that negative influence and to change our way of thinking so that we don't build upon the negative influences.
So they would have to do that deliberately plan to do specific things. And I think reading inspirational material would be one way to start that, to read something inspirational every day that's very much to the point.
To read something inspirational, something
Yes.
positive, and
Yes.
something uplifting,
Yes.
and begin to understand that the problem is within us. The
Yes.
problem's not outside.
Yes.
It's not the other people, it's us. And anytime we have a negative influence in our life, it's a fault or an influence that's within us, and we have to change.
Yes.
So often we want the world to change. We want our children or our neighbors or our friends to change. But really what we need to do and what we need to pray is that God will change us.
Yes. And ask, how can we reach out to others? There's a poem, what can I do to help you, God? So they could ask, what can I do to help you, God? And really look for ways and ask in the meditation to ask, how can I reach out to others? In what way? Because obviously they don't really know how, or they would be doing it anyway. So to ask, and then they would receive inspiration on how they could. And the next time the phone rings or a letter comes, they could respond right away in a positive way and just deliberately make a new plan, a life plan.
Mm-hmm. But as we see ourselves being, having a feeling of isolation or loneliness, that's when we need to begin the inner work.
Yes. Well, and very often we can't see that because we wouldn't be in that position if we could. But those people who are of long-standing loneliness, and I know many who are, and they're the ones who always complain, those who have been lonely forever, well, they're the ones who are not doing the things we're just saying need to be done. How would you reach someone who is enmeshed in that shell of loneliness?
I think the beginning point is to identify with that person that their loneliness is not and has nothing to do with what's happening outside. It has something to do with what's happening inside them. And of course, we have to be conscious or cautious of our preachiness.
Yeah.
And probably the best way is to walk our talk instead of just talking it. But I think if people do identify to us that they are lonely, that they're isolated, that they feel this way, then we can identify with them and share with them the fact that it's something that's happening inside them, and invite them not to deal with the externals, but to deal with what's happening inside, and maybe give them some advice in terms of meditation, prayer, reinforcement, looking to positive affirmation, visualization, and then let them go. Because some people are going to be isolated and alone until they identify.
And they're going to be happy in their own mind living in that way because they don't know any better, and they don't know how to accept or how to reach.
And we can't save the world.
Yeah.
The best that we can do is to try to help people and identify with them. If they reach out to us, tell us that they have a problem. But if they're a person who is lonely and is just immersed and enjoying their loneliness, we can pray for them. We can send them love and light. We can help them as much as we can in a passive way. But in some cases, people need to endure what they need to endure until they reach out. And in many cases, they reach out to us by saying, I'm so lonely and I'm so isolated. What can I do? And at that point, I think we could begin to talk to them in a substantive way.
So you're saying only if they ask us, then are we able to really reach them? Otherwise, it seems preachy.
We can, I think, reach out to them always, but I think we need to be cautious because we're not going to change someone's way of thinking unless they are open and receptive to changing their way of thinking. So we share with them by our example of life and by our own way of thinking, and we certainly pray for them and we send them vibrations of love and light and reach out in those ways. But I think we need to be cautious of telling people what their problems are.
Because people know what their own problems are, but it breaks your heart to see someone so lonely that they're miserable and yet they're just mired down in their own negativity and their own lack of of being creative in relationships.
And then we can go back to the issue of the power of prayer.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing. We can always pray for people. We can always meditate. We can always send them the
Light.
vibration and light and the love of God. And that has a positive influence. And so many times we could do better by praying for someone than we can preaching to them.
I know I've been tempted sometimes to isolate myself for more prayer and meditation work. And every time I make that decision that I would like to be able to do that, I read something that tells me that that's not the way it's done. And that's mentioned in several different books today, that we can't isolate ourselves because that's not the way we grow, and we addressed that earlier today, that's not how we grow, and that's not what we're here for. We're here to interact.
And the learning experiences of life. And sometimes isolation and loneliness will teach us great lessons. And so at different points in our lives, we may be isolated, but that is really a red flag to us to change our way of thinking, and that something needs to change, and what really needs to change is us inside.
And to look to spiritual values, first of all, to see what we can do to change that within ourselves, and to look, therefore, how to reach out to others. Because if you want to have a friend, be a friend, is such a trite saying, but that's true. And the people who don't reach out then would be the ones who are self-defeating.
And it's important, too, that people understand that they don't need to change religions or change churches or change their faith tradition, that no matter what your faith tradition, no matter what your belief system, by connecting with the divine and by changing yourself within, you can overcome the loneliness and the isolation.
Yeah, I'm sure that is true in every religion that they teach how to avoid loneliness. But I attended a Raja Yoga meditation meeting last week, and it was one of the most peaceful times I've ever had. And of course, I'm very, as you, Christ-centered in my beliefs. But that was just very, very peaceful. And that woman is reaching out to help others with her meditation in her home.
Right. And we need to reach out to others, and we've been doing that with you and sharing ways to overcome loneliness and isolation. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Such a blessing, I can't depart. Confident living helps me expand visions of value, the kingdom at hand. Confident living, talent to win, gift of the Spirit moves from within.